Where does the energy for life processes come from? If you think about what you ate for lunch today, maybe you had some carrots, maybe you had a salad, maybe a turkey sandwich. If you were to trace each of those things, where that food source came from, eventually you would be able to trace that back to a producer. And a producer is an organism that gets their energy from non-living resources. So they actually make their own food. So, AKA, I also want you to know this as an autotroph. Auto means self, troph means nourishment. So if you trace back to where these producers actually got their energy, most producers get their energy from sunlight. This is the main source of energy. So photosynthesis, most producers, as I said, rely on the sun, and they go through a process called photosynthesis. Photo means light, synthesize means to make. So sunlight energy is used to convert carbon dioxide and water, these are non-organic, into chemical energy in the form of carbohydrates, which is an organic substance. And most producers go through this process. You can see down here the equation. Plants will rely on 6 molecules of carbon dioxide, 6 molecules of water, and using that sunlight energy, they will convert that and use that energy to form and rearrange those elements into something called sugar, which is a simple carbohydrate, C6H12O6, and then they'll give off as a byproduct 6 oxygen molecules. Obviously, this is a continuous cycle. We rely on the oxygen, we give off carbon dioxide, the plants use our carbon dioxide, and they go through this process. While most producers do go through photosynthesis, some producers do rely on a process called chemosynthesis. And this is a process by which, well, if you look at the name, chemo means chemical, synthesis means to make. So it's a process by which organisms form carbohydrates using chemicals rather than light as their energy source. There's a couple of examples. We find these in deep sea vents, sulfur-rich salt marsh flats, hydrothermal pools, and a lot of times we're looking actually at bacteria that are producers. So let's look at the first one. A deep sea vent is actually where you would see it's near volcanically active places, so where tectonic plates are actually moving apart. And there are chemicals that are dissolved in the vent fluids, making it a great host of complex communities, unlike the majority of the deep sea. A lot of bacteria are going to use those chemicals that are present there to actually go through a process of chemosynthesis to make their own food. Again, we see bacteria in hot springs that go through a similar process. You'll see bacteria that produce their own food in salt marshes. And this is a land, or this is a space between land and open salt water. Sometimes it's called brackish water. And it has, a lot of plants have a very high salt tolerant level. And a lot of bacteria here will actually use chemicals to go through chemosynthesis as well. While not everything is a producer, obviously we are consumers, and a consumer is an organism that gets their energy by eating other living or once living resources. You can see the cow here eating the hay or straw, whatever that is, that was actually once living. A panther, on the other hand, will rely on meat. So there's a couple different types of consumers. I also want you to know consumer as heterotroph. Hetero means different, and troph means nourishment. These are the Greek meanings of those terms. There are a couple different consumers. First, let's look at an herbivore. These are organisms that only eat plants. Herb is actually Latin for grass. So if you think of the word herb, these organisms only eat plants, like a cow, like an elephant, many different examples you could think of. Carnivore are organisms that only eat other animals. Carn actually means flesh in Latin, and so these organisms eat flesh. Okay, you could think of, let's think of a wolf. A wolf is only going to eat meat. You could think of that panther that we just saw in the picture before, only eats meat. Omna actually means all in Latin. So an omnivore eats all things, both plants and animals. So if you think of a bear can eat plants like berries and things like that, and also rely on fish and other wildlife for its source of food. A scavenger is what eats or consumes carcasses of other animals. So they will actually pick off of, it's like the organism that eats the leftovers. Nobody else wants the leftovers. These scavengers come through and actually continue the process of consuming an organism. Decomposers break down organic matter into simpler compounds. They actually break things down into detritus. And detritus is a non-living matter. It's usually composed of dead organisms, fecal matter. It's kind of like a little bit like leaf litter in soil. And so a lot of decomposers like bacteria will continue the process of decay, restoring nutrients back to the soil. Detrivores actually eat detritus. And again, like I said, detritus is this dead organic matter, this non-living material. You could think of fungi as a good example of detrivores. They actually break down that detritus within the soil and again help restore nutrients to the soil. A specialist, I would like you to know the difference between a specialist and a generalist. A specialist is a species that relies on one or a small number of food sources. These organisms are also very sensitive to changes in the availability of their prey. So I want you to think of a specialist almost like a picky eater. Some of you were probably very picky eaters growing up. Maybe you only ate bologna, or maybe you only ate macaroni and cheese. These are kind of like our specialists within the ecosystem. An example would be a snail kite. The snail kite depends on the apple snail as its main food source. So if you got rid of that apple snail, a specialist like this snail kite would really be in harm's way because you're depleting its main food source. I'm going to give you a couple other examples here. The sword-billed hummingbird, you can look at how long its bill is. So it actually relies on only a certain number of flowers, with flowers that have a long corolla. And so this bird, if those flowers, became extinct, this bird would really have a hard time surviving. Another example would be a koala. A koala lives primarily on eucalyptus, and eucalyptus is typically toxic for most animals, yet a koala can consume that, and that's its main food source. So these are examples of specialists. A generalist is an organism that does not rely on a single source of food. So they have a varying diet. They can also survive in a lot of different environments. So example is a gray wolf. They might eat elk or moose or white-tailed deer or beavers or mice. They're not relying just on elk to complete their main food supply. They can rely on a lot of other things. Another example would be a cockroach. A cockroach survives in most climates, and it really just needs moisture really to survive and a food source. And cockroaches you can find just about anywhere in the world. Rats also are found everywhere, but in the Arctic, they're not picky eaters. They'll eat anything. Raccoon is another example. They have a very wide diet. I mean, you can see this one coming out of the trash. They'll eat just about anything. They're an omnivore, and wherever there's trees, brush, or some sort of structure, a raccoon can live there. And so again, they're a generalist. Last example I had here was this horseshoe crab. These organisms have a very wide diet, and they live on the sea floor, eating off of the sea floor. Temperature, they survive a lot of changes in temperature, low oxygen levels. They can even wash up on shore and survive a while without the source of oxygen.